Chapter 32. Mr. Augustus Dowling gives his sister Martha notice to quit the premises, which occasions Michael to appear in a new character. A long journey taken by novices, but they do not lose their way, and they arrive at the right place at last. The circumstances which immediately followed are not of sufficient consequence to detain us long. Our old acquaintance, Mr. Augustus, now Major Dowling, of the regiment, quartered at a distance of a day's journey, was sent for to get through the melancholy business of going on in his paternal mansion, as well as he could, to give orders respecting the funeral, and to make himself as thoroughly acquainted with the real state of his family affairs as circumstances would permit. Michael, meanwhile, had taken leave of the weeping Martha, without having given her the slightest hint as to the means by which Sir Matthew's body had been released. Had he not known that Mr. Augustus, whose kicks and pinches he had so well remembered, was expected to arrive for the protection of his sister, and of whatever property they might still call their own, he would have hardly made up his mind to leave her, however conscious he might have been of the doubtful propriety of offering such protection as he could give. But it was evident that the poor girl thought he had better go, though it was equally so that she parted from him with the greatest reluctance. "You shall hear from me," she said, "my good Michael, and if it should never be my good fortune to see you more, remember me with the same forgiving kindness that you have shown through all the dreadful scenes you have witnessed here. You have a good and generous heart, Michael, and though I know you suffered much by being present at them, you will always like to remember how greatly your presence helped to support your early friend in her great affliction." But it was not destined that these sad scenes should be the last in which Michael and his early friend were to be thrown together. In little more than a week after the death of Sir Matthew, and while Michael was still anxiously waiting at Fairley for such tidings from her as might put him at liberty to set off without further delay for Nice, a packet reached him from Dowling Lodge, containing 2 letters. One was from Martha, and contained these words: "Dear Michael, my brother tells me that all of us who are old enough must seek our own living, and that there is nothing left to support us. Myself especially, he says, must, to use his own words, look about me directly, as my behavior to the family has never been such as to justify my looking to any of them for assistance. This amounts to my being actually turned out of doors, an exigency which at this moment leaves me no other resource than what is afforded by the enclosed letter. Read it, Michael, and let me know if you are willing to give me your assistance and protection in reaching the amiable writer of it. I could never have accepted, even for a day, the hospitality she so generously offers, could I not prove to her, by bringing you with me, that the sad subject which interrupted our friendship some 7 or 8 years ago could never again be the source of pain to either of us. My dear father's last act towards me, which was, as I think I told you, the placing of a few £100 in my hands for the express purpose of my leaving the country, will enable me to undertake this long journey without being a burden upon you. The green pocket-book, Michael, so well known to Mr. Parsons and Lady Clarissa, as the repository of my father's ready money, and so disgracefully struggled for during his last moments, will prove of no value to its possessors beyond its morocco cover and its silken lining, for the notes which he took from it to give me were the last he ever placed in it. My messenger has orders to wait for your reply. If it will suit you to immediately accompany me to Nice, my first stage shall be the little inn at Fairley, which you mentioned to me. I fear that you will find me a weak and troublesome traveller, but I think I have been improving in health ever since I learnt that I had not your death to answer for. Your grateful friend, Martha Dowling." The other letter was from Miss Brotherton, and ran thus: "Need I tell you, my dear Martha, with what feelings I received the news of your present painful position? Your father's marriage with Lady Clarissa was, for your sake, a source of great sorrow to me, for I was certain that your domestic happiness would be destroyed by it, and this most unexpected event of your father's bankruptcy makes me feel quite sure that you have no longer a comfortable home in England. Come then to me, my dear Martha. The painful estrangement which grew between us just when I was beginning to know and value your excellent qualities has long been a source of very painful regret to me, because I am aware that I judged you unfairly and pronounced that judgment harshly. Be generous, then, and prove that you can forgive this by immediately giving me the pleasure of receiving you as my guest. When we are together, we will consult about what will be best for the future, but at any rate, I have the satisfaction of knowing the climate to which I am inviting you is likely to be beneficial to your health during the approaching winter. Come to me, then, dear friend, without delay. On the other side you will find the route sketched that I recommend you for your journey. My quarters are roomy enough to accommodate either man or maidservant, or both, if it will suit you to be so accompanied. Ever, my dear Martha, affectionately yours, Mary Brotherton. The consequence of this packet was another metamorphosis on the part of Mchl. She shall not think, said he, addressing Mr. Bell, that my respect for her is lessened because her fortune has fallen. I will wait upon her with faithful duty and most grateful affection. But she was born in a palace, and I in a cabin, and I will not, especially just now, obtrude myself upon her as a companion. As her servant, I hope I may be useful to her, and it is in this capacity that I shall attend her. There was so much good feeling shown in this project that Mr. Bell could not oppose it, whatever he might think of its necessity, and Mchl, therefore, gave the astonished Martha the meeting at the little inn she had named, in the character of a very neat and respectable-looking manservant. Her faithful Betty Parker, who had consented to be the companion of her journey, was in the room with her when Mchl made his appearance at the door to receive her orders. The cautious manner in which he made her comprehend his purpose, and the nature of the office he had assumed, suggested to her the propriety of not discussing it in the presence of the well-contented Betty, who was exceedingly comforted by discovering that the young man whom her mistress had informed her would travel with them was to do so as her fellow-servant, as she by no means felt herself capable of becoming servant of all work to a young lady travelling through foreign countries, of which she had never even heard the names. But having contrived to dismiss her female attendant on an errand, Martha began to restrumerate with her faithful squire upon the great mistake he had made in fancying that she had ever thought of travelling with him in any other capacity than that of a friend. All she said, however, was in vain. Mchl, though in a manner the most humbly respectful, persisted in his purpose, and the most destitute girl was therefore constrained to set off upon her travels in a style which she felt to be very unfitting to her situation. Her conscience, however, could not reproach her for this, for most assuredly she could not help it. Many were the letters, and various the mementos of affection, instructed by Mr. and Mrs. Bell to the care of Mchl for their dearly beloved Mary Brotherton. Nor was there an individual of whose welfare he thought it would please her to hear, whom he did not visit to receive their loving blessings for the benefactress who, notwithstanding her wide wanderings, had never failed to remember the wants of all who had faithfully served her, or in any way become dependent on her bounty. These dutiful duties completed, and a farewell of most grateful affection uttered to the amiable clergyman and his excellent wife, Mchl set off upon his long journey with the feelings of hope, joy, confidence, fear, diffidence, and trembling affection, all so strongly mixed together in his bosom that had his life depended upon it, he could not himself have told which it was that was the most frequently preponderated. Yet, altogether his state of mind was very delightful. The novelty and excitement of journeying, so pregnant of enjoyment to most of us, was most especially captivating to him, whose education had been little more than the unchecked development of imagination, and of that of keen observation of all surrounding objects which his shepherding life had taught him. The first painful interruption to the state of felicity arose from his finding himself under the necessity of confessing to Martha that he had no more money wherewith to pay their way. Aware that in this performance of his self-appointed office Mchl would have to pay everything and keep a regular account of it, and aware also that the money he had received from her would enable him to do this, without giving him the additional trouble of daily settlements with her, she had merely said, a minute or two before they set off, "You'll be kind enough to be my banker, Mchl, during the journey, and we will settle accounts at the end of it." For just 1 week from the day of their leaving Fairly, he was able to do this, but then the little remnant of his treasure failed him, and great was his repugnance to the measure, which he was compelled by dire necessity to confess that nearly the whole of her generous gift had gone to satisfy the rapacity of Mr. Parsons. It would be hardly possible for one human being to be more grateful to another than poor Martha felt for her young attendant after this disclosure. She remembered the agony which he had made to cease. She remembered, too, her state of utter incapacity even to comprehend, and still less to avert the horrors that surrounded her, and, spite of all of Mchl's respectful efforts to induce her to perform her allotted character properly, she never from the hour of this disclosure treated him otherwise than as a dear and valued friend. As their journey approached its termination, however, to which period Mchl had looked with peculiar anxiety as that most important to the dignity of Martha, there was one argument, and only one, by which he was able to coax her into letting him make his first appearance before Miss Brotherton in the character of her servant, and this was his very natural wish to ascertain whether Edward and Fanny would recognize him. It was therefore still in the dress and with the demeanour of a servant that the poor factory boy, now become a tall and very handsome young man, armed himself with courage to enter the presence of his brother, and once more to draw near the dear and gentle little being whom he had so fondly loved during the miserable period they had passed together at the Deep Valley. It had been previously agreed between himself and Martha that when she sent for him it would be for the purpose of giving him some long and particular instructions respecting the luggage he was to get from the custom house, in order to give him time to look and be looked at before the moment of discovery should arrive. The young man trembled like an aspen leaf as he laid his hands upon the lock of the door, the opening of which would bring him face to face with his brother, and perchance he might have indulged in a longer interval of preparation, had not the voice of Martha distinctly pronounced the words, "Come in!" Further delay was out of the question. He pushed forward the door and entered. The first figure that his eyes fell upon was that of a young lady, small and of very delicate proportions, whose head, which was hanging over some employment as the door opened, was raised as he entered, displaying to him a very lovely face and a pair of eyes whose dark brilliance almost made the beholder wink. Could that be Fanny Fletcher? No. Yet that it should be Miss Brotherton seemed more impossible still. Like all young people who have been separated from someone considerably older than themselves, ever since the period when this difference made one of them appear fully grown, while the other was still a child, Mchl fancied that Miss Brotherton he would see an elderly person, no more like a pretty girl than he was himself. But Mary Brotherton had not fully completed her 29th year, and happening, moreover, to be very peculiarly young-looking in both face and figure, it was not wonderful that he should doubt of her identity, for it was in truth Mary Brotherton, and no other, whose bright and laughing loveliness made him turn his admiring eyes away in search of something dearer, though not more beautiful. At the end of the sofa, at which Miss Brotherton sat with Martha Dowling beside her, was a young female figure which presented only a profile to his gaze, but that was enough. The delicate oval face and the sweet regular small features, the glossy light brown hair parted Madonna-like upon the ivory brow, and the long eyelash that seemed to rest upon her cheek as she read, all proclaimed that he looked upon the same gentle loving creature whose soft voice had whispered "Patience," when his spirit but for her had died within him. At the sight of this sweet vision, that in shadowy and uncertain outline, had so often visited his reveries, Mchl's manhood almost forsook him, and large tears gathered in his eyes, which he was fain to hide by turning round again and performing some blundering operation with the lock of the door. Martha played her part admirably, appearing to be the most exceedingly particular young lady about boxes, bags, and desks that ever travelled. "Remember, I beg," she said, "that you see yourself to the opening of every package. Don't let them touch a single article that you do not watch the whole time, and be sure that everything is locked again, and on no account forget the covers, or mismatch them, and remember particularly," etc., 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 and so she ran on, at the imminent risk of being classed by her clever friend Mary as the veriest fidget that ever arrived to bore a peaceful peaceable household, and all in order to give her poor companion time to recover himself and see distinctly what was before him. But Michael could not recover himself, nor could he even find the courage to look about him. It was a large saloon that Miss Brotherton occupied, and the agitated young man rather felt that there was a gentleman occupied with books and papers at a distant table, than saw him. Yet to see him he was determined, if his life was to be forfeit, and turning his head with an eye as troubled as that of Hamlet, when trembling following his father's spirit, he stood at last with clasped hands, protruded head, and features almost convulsed with emotion, when he had an uninterrupted view of his brother's calm and beautiful countenance. Edward was very busily employed, and unconsciously submitted himself to this examination without raising his eyes or moving in any way. But Miss Brotherton's ear caught something like a sob from the silent object of all Martha's eloquence, and, suddenly looking up, perceived Michael in the attitude described, but stealthily and perhaps unknowingly approaching Edward's table, while tears he could no longer check rolled down his manly cheek. There are some individuals of human family gifted with such quickness of perception and rapidity of inference that their faculties act with the certainty of instinct and the brilliancy of inspiration. Miss Brotherton was one of those, and after looking for a minute or two at Michael, quite as earnestly as Michael looked at Edward, she sprung from the sofa, pushed the table that stood before it with such violence from her as it nearly overset it, and rushing forward, lay her hand upon his arm, exclaiming, "For mercy's sake, tell me, young man, who are you, and where do you come from?" On hearing these words, in a voice unusually loud and agitated, Edward rose hastily from his seat, and approached Miss Brotherton as if to protect her from some threatened danger. But turning towards him, she held up her hand as if to prevent his hostile approach, and said, "Stay, Edward, stay! Look at him! Good heaven! Look at him, dear Edward, and tell me who he is like." Thus addressed, Edward did look at his brother, and for a moment with a countenance that seemed to say Miss Brotherton had lost her wits. But suddenly Michael smiled at him as he caught his puzzled eye, and then he started and almost gasped for breath, and as his distracted eyes fixed themselves upon the agitated face before him, as if they would read it in the history of the years. "Edward! Teddy!" cried Michael, opening his arms and making a step in advance. In the next instant the brothers were locked in each other's arms, and Miss Brotherton drew back and gazed upon them from a distance, as if the very ground that sustained hearts under the influence of such feeling was holy, while Fanny Fletcher rose and sat down, and rose again, checking the feelings that would have sent her to stretch forth a hand to welcome to her old friend, by telling herself that no hand, no voice but Edward's could be cared for then. And perhaps she was right, for it is certain that for several minutes neither Edward nor Michael were fully conscious where they were, nor who they might be that were near them. Once and again each beating heart was strained against brother's heart, and then, their right hands clasped, and the left placed on each other's shoulders, they fell to such a perusal of the face that now, after 8 cruel years of absence, was once more beaming with love and sympathy before their eyes, that it must have been a very heartless and soulless being who should have come between them. Though such a history as Michael's might have well occupied more than one long summer's day in the telling, to ears so greedy of every circumstance connected with it as were those of Edward, yet it is wonderful how very short a time sufficed to point out the keystone of the arch upon which the whole wonderful fabric hung, and then it was that Fanny Fletcher's voice was heard exclaiming in a burst of uncontrollable emotion, "Then it was I that caused it all! Oh, Miss Brotherton, it was I who kept him in that horrid place for years. Had I not told you he was dead, it would have been he who would have been the happy object of your bounty, instead of me. Oh, how can he ever forgive me?" This was uttered with such agitated rapidity that though there was more than one present who would have been ready enough to contradict the self-accusing statement, she gave them no time for it, but it sufficed to draw Michael from the side of his brother and to place him at hers, and though this terrible thought drew a shower of tears from Fanny's eyes, notwithstanding the exceeding happiness which was at the very same moment throbbing at her heart, it may be that there could not have been found a more effectual mode of at once bringing back the long parted friends to the same tone of familiar intercourse in which they had parted, as this sincere self-recrimination on one part, and the warm pleading against its injustice on the other. For some minutes this lasted without being interrupted by a word from anyone, for both Mary and Edward found sufficient occupation in looking at them both, and then exchanging expressive glances of thanksgiving and happiness with each other. But at length, upon Fanny's saying with a fresh burst of tears, "Oh, Michael, Michael, your eloquence is all in vain. You will never, never teach me to forget that I have been enjoying the blessed destiny intended for you, and that by means of words uttered by myself." Upon her saying this, the happy Mary Brotherton pushed a low taboret before the reunited friends, and seating herself upon it, took Fanny's hand in hers, and said, "If you would not cry about it, my dear Fanny, I should think it was a mighty pretty exhibition of true feeling and false argument that we are witnessing. But if you really intend to be unhappy, we shall all range ourselves immediately on Michael's side, and laugh you to scorn for your sophistry, and the deplorable confusion you are making between cause and effect. I should like to know, little lady, how much it would have profited our Michael had you refused to answer when I inquired at the Deep Valley factory if you knew aught about him. Had you, while firmly believing he was dead, declined to state your belief, lest you might be mistaken, what would it have availed him, darling? Could he have crept down before us from his sick bed to settle the question? No, dear casuist, you know better. Your looks are much more wise than your words, Fanny, for even now, though you pretend to shake your head, your truth-telling eyes confess that you have not another syllable to say." "But is it not singular," said Martha, who had been contemplating the scene with unspeakable delight, "is it not singular that Michael should twice have been the victim of words uttered in by such friendly lips?" "Singular, dear Martha," replied Mary. "Is not every event connected with a hero of romance, of necessity, and by an immutable prescription, singular? And whom did fate and fortune ever fix upon a more unmistakably to fill that distinguished position in society than Mchl Armstrong? Why are we together here? Wholly and solely because Mchl Armstrong saved Lady Clarissa Shrimpton from the terrors inspired by a cow. Is that not so, dear friends? Can any of you deny that all the exceeding happiness that blesses us at this moment has arisen from that most marvelously silly adventure? And shall any of us quarrel at the steps, though some of them, it must be confessed, were rough enough, which have led from that nonsensical beginning to an end which has made us all so very happy? Yes, Mchl Armstrong is a hero. He is our hero. He is the crowning blessing that is come to make us all thank heaven for having brought us every one from greater and less degree of misery to the very perfect happiness. And shall we not welcome him with smiles instead of tears, Fanny?" Nothing could have been more admirably suited to the effect which the happy heiress meant to produce than those words. How, after this, could Michael shrink, as he expected to do, from the humiliating comparison between Edward and Fanny with himself? Or how could Fanny persist in weeping when her own heart, as well as those all around her, was so cheeringly called upon to rejoice? Nothing of the sort was any longer thought by either. Without very well knowing how it came about, Michael, of all the multitude of contending feelings which had so lately been cruelly assailing him, being as they were of that most harassing race begotten between fear and hope, was now conscious only of one, and that one was happiness unmixed. His frank and generous nature could no longer harbor any doubts as to the place he held in the affections of those whom he had lately thought of as almost too high and too happy to remember him. He was with them, he was of them, and if a thought of the future glanced athwart the delicious present, it came accompanied by a buoyant consciousness that there was that within him which would enable him to redeem lost time, and that whatever those he loved wished him to be, that he should have the power to become. Nor was an answering confidence wanting in those who wearied not of gazing at his bright, expressive features and his noble form. Fanny thought that he was exactly everything she would have dreamed he must be, had she ventured to dream that he existed at all. Mary thought that she had read capacity which promised power to become all that Edward could wish him to be, and he was not disposed to wish for more. And Edward himself thought and felt that had he power to choose a brother from among all the nations of the earth, and the noblest of them, Mchl would have been the one he would have selected. "And where is my dear good Tremlett?" said Miss Brotherton. "In the midst of all this rare felicity she must not be left out. She has shared our mourning for your loss, dear Mchl, and shame it were she should not share our joy at finding you." "Shall I go and call her hither?" cried Fanny, rising. "No, that you shall not do, Fanny," replied Miss Brotherton. "I will not trust you. It was I who dragged the dear good soul from post to pillar in order to find you, Mchl. It was I who never let her know rest, night nor day, because you were not. And who but I shall bring her to the glad tidings of your restoration?" But truly delighted as was Miss Brotherton at the idea of the pleasure she would well knew this unlooked arrival would cause her old friend, she would not let her taste it without the addition of a little mystification, and accordingly she led her into the room which contained the happy party, with no other preparation than telling her that there was a young Englishman in the saloon, to whom she must come and be introduced, because he was a countryman. To this the tractable old lady agreed, without testifying any very lively emotions, but when she got into the midst of the group and witnessed the general exaltation of spirits which seemed to possess them all, after looking and listening for a little while, she could not help whispering to Fanny, "Do you know, my dear, who that young man is? I never saw Miss Brotherton, no, nor Mr. Armstrong either, seem to be so extraordinarily intimate with anyone before, just at first sight." In reply to this, Fanny only hid her face and laughed, for she dared not trust her voice to give the information required. "How very odd!" murmured the old lady, drawing her knitting from her bag. "It is very odd, Miss Tremlett, very odd indeed," said Mary. "There is no denying it, but the fact is that Mr. Armstrong has taken such an extraordinary fancy to this young man that I really think I shall be obliged to ask him to live with us. There will be plenty of room, you know, in my Rhenish castle." The old woman said not a word in reply, but she looked puzzled and vexed, and shook her head, as much as to say that it was not like her young mistress to talk such nonsense as that. So, in her own defence, Mary was obliged to explain the mystery, and as happy an old woman was Nurse Tremlett, as she looked and listened, as ever tasted joy from the contemplation of it in others.